Yeah. Yeah. There's room, there's meeting rooms down there.
There's a document on there like this for each meeting.
Do what? I know. Okay. Where is Barbara?
John, I was going to ask you where you retired from, but I learned in your video. It was wonderful. Which I need you to come to our church.
Well, I'd be glad to. Barbara, I have made you host, and I'm going to leave this meeting and go to my other one.
Thanks, John. Let's give it a few minutes, folks. I have 12:56, so let's give it till at least 1 o'clock and see how many folks join us.
I love that most of us are named Donna Chase. It let me change it. You can change your name if you want to.
That was an improvement for me, Jimmy.
Will the real Donna Chase please stand up?
She's not even on here right now. I sent out her link. I'm guilty.
But at least yours let us change our names. Normally when they, don't let you, they put your name up, it has to remain that. There she is.
Donnie, you got a lot of names.
Well, the real Donna Chase, please stand up.
Does this mean I can say whatever I want and blame it on Donna?
Hey Liz, how are you today?
Hi, Jimmy. I'm good. How are you?
I am well. Did Christian send you the link?
I used the link that you sent me.
Okay. All right. I think she's trying to get on now. She sent me an email.
I'm here.
Oh, you're Donna Chase too.
I didn't realize we had done this cloning thing so well.
Well, I am not Donna Chase. So what I will do is welcome you all to this webinar with Reverend Jimmie Hawkins. And I believe, Frank Dew, you are going to do the honors of the introduction. Is that correct?
That's correct. Thank you, Barbara.
Mm-hmm.
And thanks to everyone for joining us. We are indeed honored to have the Reverend Jimmie Hawkins. we consider him one of our own in Salem Presbytery, and especially in Greensboro. And I know that a number of the Washington staff are going to be on with us, and I'm sure that Jimmie will be introducing them as we go along. I wanted just to begin by sharing a brief scripture, and this is from Proverbs chapter 31, verses 8 and 9. It's appropriate for our focus today on Matthew 25, our mission focus, as well as the advocacy of the local church. Speak out for those who cannot speak, for the rights of all the destitute. Speak out, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and needy. That's Proverbs chapter 31, verses 8 and 9. You might want to write that down. Occasionally people ask me, well, what's the biblical basis of what you're doing? And Reverend Hawkins, thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Frank. You're absolutely right. I'm so much at home with Salem Presbytery. I labored within your bounds for 2 years. Reverend Joseph Flora, who was the campus minister at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, I got a chance to be an intern campus minister with Joe, and also was at St. James as a youth minister. And so this is home. And Frank has obviously been a longtime friend, and Donna and I went to school together. So I'm just so thrilled to be here. And obviously, when I first came into this position back in 2017, Salem Presbytery was one of the first invitations that I received in over 2 years. And we had planned to do it 3 years. COVID got in the way, but we did many advocacy workshop training over the course of the weekend. So again, I'm just so glad to be here with you. I actually am doing the work of introducing my colleagues who are going to lead much of this discussion on voting rights. We have Christian Brooks. Christian was formerly known as Donna Chase, but she has her video on right now. And Christian is for the Office of Public Witness in DC, our domestic representative, and also deals with environmental justice. And we also have with us Liz Corsick, who is a member of Charlotte Presbytery at Myers Park Presbyterian Church, and she works there. We're working on Liz to go to seminary, and so you can put a plug in for that as you wish. And she's one of our YAB Young Adult Volunteers for this year, and has done a wonderful job. So we're very well represented. We know the situation with voting rights. Donna, did you want to say anything? Okay, we know the situation with voting rights in this country, that they are under attack, and especially many of the attacks are targeting marginalized communities, people of color, African Americans, and also it hits impoverished people as well with voter ID laws. And we as people of faith, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, Christian, in this, I think what Frank did at the beginning is of vital importance, that this is a part of discipleship when we talk about advocacy and justice issues. And a part of our Christian understanding is that we are people who worship a God of justice. And you can't read the Bible without talking about justice. So we see voting rights as a justice issue. And therefore we see it as the work of the church. And we really would like to issue an invitation to any congregation that wishes for us to come out and to do a conversation with your congregation about the work that we do, about how we see it as a part of discipleship. Because again, our Washington office is the Office of Public Witness. And that means we're witnesses to Christ in the public arena. So with that having been said, I turn it over to Christian and to Liz.
Hello, everyone. So glad to be with you here today. I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to share. So let me just get set up. And I have 2 screens. So if you see me looking over here, that's because you all are over here and the PowerPoint is over here. So let me just get set up really quickly. Okay, it looks like screen sharing has been disabled by whoever is running the Zoom. So,
I think I have the capability of doing that. So let me yeah, I'm the host.
okay. Okay, so while we're getting set up, let me just introduce myself again. My name is Christian Brooks. I am the Associate for Domestic Issues at the Office of Public Witness. So as Jimmie stated, I run the domestic policy portfolio. Anything domestic related falls under me: voting rights, education, environmental justice, climate change, all of those things. And I have my associate here with me, Liz Corsick. Liz, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Liz Korsig. Like Jimmie said, I'm also coming to you all from North Carolina. I'm in Charlotte right now. I work with Christian. I am a fellow for her. I'm the domestic issues fellow is my official title. So I focus a lot on climate justice. And then I've also been doing a lot with voting rights as well. So I'm excited to be here. Thank you, guys.
Christian, I've obviously made you the host. So when you're done screen sharing, if you could send it back to me, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely. Okay. Can you all see my PowerPoint? Yes. Okay, great. Okay, now I have my notes up. Can you see my notes? Or you still see the PowerPoint?
You just see the PowerPoint.
Okay, awesome. All righty, so we have gone over introductions. So let me just do a brief agenda. We are going to go over a little bit of background for why we need voting rights legislation. We will go over 3 different pieces of legislation, where that legislation is now. We will have a call to action for you all, and then we will open up the floor for question and answer. So let's get started. Okay, so why do we even need voting rights legislation, right? So we had the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 has slowly been chipped away at since 2013. In 2013, the Supreme Court basically nullified Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Now, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act is the pre-clearance section. It is the section that says that states that have a history of passing discriminatory laws have to go through the federal government before they can enact any laws. However, in Section 4B, there was a formula that determined which states went on that pre-clearance list. In the 2013 Supreme Court decision, they nullified or they declared Section 4B as unconstitutional because they said that the formula was outdated. So by declaring Section 4B as unconstitutional, that therefore made Section 5 just nullified, because if there are no states on the pre-clearance list, then nobody has to go through pre-clearance. So this has been an issue that we've been fighting for since 2013. But then again, in 2021, there was another voting rights case that came before the Supreme Court. This voting rights case was about 2 laws that were passed in Arizona, and those laws were discriminatory, or the case was that those laws were discriminatory. However, in the Supreme Court's decision, they narrowly applied Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act basically gives citizens the right to bring cases against jurisdictions and localities, states, when there are laws that are in place that are discriminatory. Because the Supreme Court narrowly applied Section 2, it deemed those laws to not be discriminatory. This then set precedent in the future, which is going to make it harder for other discriminatory cases moving forward. So as I said, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 just slowly chipped away at and chipped away at. But also, so in 2020, the federal election had the highest voter turnout in the country, or within a century, at 66.7% of people voting. However, in the following year, 2021, states passed the highest number of voter suppression laws in the past 10 years. 19 state legislators passed 34 laws restricting the right to vote. So these laws included voter ID requirements, reducing polling place hours and locations, increasing roll purges, increasing restrictions on mail-in ballots. And we have a couple examples here.
Christian.
So we have Georgia's SB 202.
Christian.
Huh?
Are you speaking from your PowerPoint? Yeah, I mean, have you advanced your PowerPoint? I only see the title page.
Oh, really? Okay. Sorry about that, everyone. It says that it's moving. Let me redo the share.
Yeah, recent voter restriction bills is what we see.
Recent voter restriction. Okay, yeah, that's what you should see.
Okay, now the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Okay, you're back.
Okay, yes, you should see recent voter restriction bills. That's what you see?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, good. Okay, so we have Georgia's SB 202, which Senate Bill 202. So this is the bill that prohibits anyone except for poll workers from handing out water to voters in line, and it outlaws passing out food and water to voters within 15 feet of the building that serves as a poll and inside the polling place, or within 25 feet of any voter standing in line. This bill also changed absentee voting. The earliest a voter can request their mail-in ballot is now 11 weeks before the election instead of 180 days before the election. But then there is also Texas Senate Bill 1. And this bill bans 24-hour drive-through voting and makes it more difficult for voters with disabilities and language barriers to obtain assistance in voting. In addition to these bills, in December of 2021, at least 13 bills in 4 different states were pre-filed for 2022 that would also add more restrictions to voting. Okay, so do you all see John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act?
No.
Okay, do you see it now?
Sorry.
But you still don't see it?
No.
Now
we see it.
Okay, I'm just gonna put my notes over here. Okay, so with the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, it would create a new formula that would determine which states and localities would be subject to pre-clearance. So remember earlier in the presentation, we talked about how the Supreme Court deemed Section 4B to be unconstitutional because it's out of date. Basically, this would update that formula. It would also strengthen protections against discrimination and codify prior standards for Section 2 cases. So again, we talked about the Arizona case that kind of weakened Section 2 a little bit. This would strengthen Section 2 for those discrimination cases. It would also include the Native American Voting Rights Act, which protects the rights of Native Americans to vote. So Native American and Indigenous folks have been fighting for the right to vote for about the same amount of time that African Americans have been fighting for the right to vote. So this would give protections to Indigenous and Native folks, and Yeah, it would give protections to indigenous and native folks. And it also includes protections for language minorities. So we know here in the United States, we do not have a national language. Majority of us speak English, but that is not our national language. So if there is an area where majority of the population speaks maybe Spanish or Arabic, then the voting resources in that area should be in the language that is most predominant in that area. And that's what this bill would do. Okay, so now we have the Freedom to Vote Act. So the Freedom to Vote Act was introduced into the Senate by Senator Amy Klobuchar in September 14th of 2021. Now, you might have heard of the For the People Act. The For the People Act was introduced at the beginning of 2021 and was filibustered. The Freedom to Vote Act is basically a condensed version of the For the People Act. It still has the important provisions of the For the People Act, but there are a number of things that were also taken out. So this bill focuses on voter registration, voting access, election security, redistricting, campaign finance. So this bill is really a democracy reform bill. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is a voting rights bill. This bill will tackle the whole democratic system or the democracy system. It will expand automatic and same-day voting registration and vote by mail and early voting. It also limits the purging of voter rolls. It declares Election Day as a federal holiday. The bill also states that unless an individual is serving a felony sentence at the time of the election, the right of the U.S. citizen to vote cannot be denied. And it provides new criteria for redistricting and new criteria to limit dark money in campaign financing. So the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act were actually combined into one bill. The reason that they were combined into one bill is because both of those bills got filibustered. They passed the House of Representatives, but when they got into the Senate, the bills were filibustered. So they combined them into this bill, the Freedom to Vote John Lewis Act, which includes key provisions of both the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. So the Freedom to Vote John Lewis Act was introduced into the House of Representatives by Representative Terry Sewell on August 14th of 2021. Now, this bill combines critical provisions, as I mentioned before, of the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. So where is the legislation now? Well, on January 13th of 2022, the House of Representatives passed the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act with a vote of 219 to 212. So yay, it passed the House. However, on January 19th of 2022, the act failed to pass the Senate. So the filibuster, basically, you need 60 votes in order to end the debate on a particular bill. The Senate Republicans unanimously blocked this vote. So the bill did not get the 60 votes that it needed in order to move on to a floor vote. Now, when this happened, Senator Schumer then moved to hold a vote to change the filibuster rules. However, this attempt failed. So in order to change the filibuster rules, you just need a simple majority. You don't need 60, you only need 51. However, there are two Democratic senators within the Senate that did not vote for the change of the filibuster rules. They voted against it, which is why that attempt failed as well. Okay. So I will hand it over now to Liz to talk about the Electoral Count Reform Act.
Thanks, Christian. So some of you may have heard about the Electoral Count Reform Act because it's kind of been the focus as of late when it comes to elections. So exactly as the name suggests, this act is focused on reforming the 1887 Electoral Count Act. This act you might have heard about last year, following the January 6th attack on the Capitol, as former President Trump made statements that the vice president has the power to overturn a state's electors. And he claimed that that power came from the Electoral Count Act, which we know is false. However, many lawmakers in the wake of that argued that the act is vague and that the act does not provide clear enough safeguards to prevent that kind of thing from happening and to prevent election subversion. So the need to reform this act became really clear following the January 6th attack. And this need for reform has been supported by both Democrats and a few Republicans as well. So as of right now, there have been many different proposals floated and discussed on how we might reform the law. The timeline is very unclear at the moment, and we don't actually have text we don't have a firm bill yet as far as what this might actually look like. Discussions are still ongoing. Many of the moderate members, Democrats and Republicans in the Senate, have been working together to try to reach some sort of compromise. However, a current summary suggests that the law would clarify that the vice president does not have the authority to reject a state's electors. We already know this to be true. However, in wake of January 6th, it might be necessary to clarify that that is not within the vice president's power. It also could establish specific and narrow grounds for any objection of electors by members of Congress. So as I said, both Republicans and Democrats are open to reforming the Electoral Count Act. However, this remains in its very early stages and we don't know details as far as how comprehensive this would actually be. And it's really important to note that as we're talking about voting rights, this act comes up often. People talk about the Electoral Count Reform Act. However, this act does not really address voting rights. This act would address everything that happens after voting has ended. So it really focuses on that transition of power and the certification process that Congress uses to certify electoral college votes. So it really does not help to promote voting rights as much as it does just to prevent election subversion and to ensure a peaceful transition of power. It doesn't address increasing access to the ballot box, increasing access to early voting, mail-in voting, any of those things we've already discussed. So that's just something to keep in mind as we hear more and more about this act. Awesome. And then, so as far as how you can take action and get involved, we just heard Christian talk extensively about the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. Now, you heard that that the act was blocked by Republicans in the Senate. However, this is still the voting rights legislation that we, as the Office of Public Witness for the Presbyterian Church, want to see passed. And we remain committed to that goal because we do feel that this is the most comprehensive way to ensure voting rights. The best way for you to get involved and to take action, if this is something that you feel passionate about, is to contact your senators. As I said, or as Christian said, this act was already passed by the House of Representatives, so it really remains within the Senate's hands, and that is who we would need to contact. So we have included a script here that you could use to call your senators and urge them to pass this bill, let them know that this is an issue that means a lot to you as a member of their state. And that is really the best way forward for us. You could also, if your representative voted yes for this act, you could also call and thank them for that vote and let them know that you support them as well. So that's kind of the best way to get involved with this.
Yeah, and in addition to like Liz said, calling your representative and thanking them, calling your representative and asking them to hold the line on voting rights is extremely important, but also getting involved on the state level. As I mentioned earlier, there are 19 different states that passed 34 bills. There were more bills introduced that didn't necessarily pass. So understanding what is going on in your state is going to be really important, because if we can't move at the federal level, then we can move at the state level. So keeping involved in what's going on in your state Senate, your state House of Representatives, what laws are they bringing forward? Are they voter suppression laws? Are they going to help access to the help give access to the ballot? That is extremely important. Okay, so I will stop my screen share now and bring you all back over here. So let me open up the floor if there are any, or if you all have any questions.
Yeah, Lee has her hand up.
Lee Weisner or?
I see Lee Weisner.
Okay, just want to make sure. So I have a question. I feel like voting rights and the pieces of legislation that were introduced across state houses all over the US is part of a larger problem too that we see a lot, specifically in North Carolina with gerrymandering. I would love to believe that the legislation about voter access is just about disenfranchising minorities and peoples of color. But from what I've found in some of the organizing work I've done in North Carolina, is even if people of color are not banned from access to voting, that a lot of our districts in North Carolina are so heavily gerrymandered that they would never, I hate to say it, but people of color and people who would tend to vote more democratically are disenfranchised even from the get-go. Even if they could vote, the way the districts are drawn, legally, representationally, I don't feel like their voices are heard very well. So that's one question I have. The second is I'm not sure that my elected officials are really care about the voting rights issue, because I think to some extent the elected officials we have in this state are benefiting from restricting access to people of color voting in this state. So I'd love to hear some thoughts, or like what's next steps, how can we organize, how can we put more pressure on elected officials or draw more attention to this issue?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm glad that you asked it. So that is the reason why there was both the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. We need both of those bills, because the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act focuses specifically on voting rights and you need access to the ballot, whereas the gerrymandering issue that you are talking about would fall under the Freedom to Vote Act. The Freedom to Vote Act would put in restrictions on redistricting, because you're absolutely right. You'll have a neighborhood that is a majority person of color neighborhood, but it's like broken up into 4 different districts. And the reason for that is, like you said, to split up the vote. So we need that democracy reform bill that is going to put restrictions on gerrymandering, put restrictions on redistricting, but we also need that voting rights bill. And as far as elected officials really not caring about this issue, that is something that I actually was on a call earlier today where we were talking about that we were really struggling with, because there are a lot of people in office who are kind of turning a blind eye to this issue, or who blatantly don't care about this issue because they're benefiting from the redistricting. They're benefiting from the gerrymandering. And at that point, honestly, it's an issue of power. It is really an issue of power, and the people in power kind of holding their feet to the fire, right? So if you are a person who is living in a state where your officials are like, hey, this issue benefits me, so whatever. Okay, where the people who don't think will turn on them need to start turning on them, right? The people who they don't think, who they think will continue to vote for them need to start speaking back. And that is an issue, or that's where we talk about kind of using your voice, using your privilege, your access in order to help others, right? In order to help our brothers and sisters who are being oppressed. I hope that answers your question.
And I'd like to chime in as well. As Christian said, one of the things that you're going to have to do is to put political pressure on the constituents who are going to, the politicians are going to be against voting rights. You know, I'm from North Carolina, lived in North Carolina, went to North Carolina Central undergrad, and people constantly ask me, what has happened to North Carolina? I mean, we used to be the most progressive Southern state and take great pride in it. And you even look at what's happened in higher education and our lack of support for public education. The state has really done a flip. And so the things that I tell individuals is, one, do what Ashton did, run for office. We have really got to weed out some of these folk who are in office. And the American public are voting for people who don't have their best interests in mind. And I do think it's going to involve people of faith, people of values, people who really want to go to office to serve, to run, to take that chance to run. And I know it's a daunting task just to undertake that in our own minds, but I would encourage you to encourage family members and friends who are going to be good legislators now, because we don't need to keep adding to the pile, but run. Think about running and supporting and being a part of campaigns. Also, and I'm just highlighting what Christian has already said, you can approach them, even if you know they're against voting rights, but you've got to make sure you've got a number of their constituents who are going to be voting specifically for them to write them letters, to engage in phone calls, people from their region. You know, if they're representing certain areas, that's all they care about. What do their voters think? And so you've got to convince them that the majority of their voters are in support of voting rights, are in support or against voter suppression. And so it's really a game of engagement right now, because to be honest with you, we're behind the 8 ball. We have gotten so far behind right now that it's going to take years before we can change the system, but it can be done. But again, it's going to take a lot of legwork. I was so happy. I was with Donna on Sunday, in the previous Sunday, and her name's Ashton, right? Your state legislator. Yeah, she was just so impressive. And the first time I came to Salem Presbytery, I was in Greensboro at First Presbyterian Church, and she came to me after my presentation. I said the same thing then, I'm saying now. She said, well, I'm running for office. And to hear that she not only ran, but she won, and is a wonderful representative for the state.
I also would love to jump in really quick to one of your points, Lee, about gerrymandering specifically in North Carolina. Like I said, I live in Charlotte, and I'm sure a lot of you guys heard last week about the North Carolina Supreme Court rejecting 14 of our congressional districts, which was a huge victory, saying that they, exactly like to what we said, limit the voice of voters of color across our state. So that was a huge victory. So that really speaks to Christian's point too, about it's not just about these federal elections. It's not just about who we elect as senators, that like who we are electing as for our state Supreme Court is more important now than ever. So really getting involved in those local on the ground races that a lot of times get so overlooked, that, you know, had we had a different makeup of our state Supreme Court, that decision could have gone really differently.
Liz,
yeah.
Liz, that was a political vote of the Supreme Court, and that's fine, because that's the way I hope we settle things in this country, by votes and not anything else. But we ought to recognize that was a political victory for one side of the spectrum, and these accusations of gerrymandering and whatever, a victory for another side. And it's good that perhaps we have some victories here and victories there to keep things somewhat balanced. Is there any room for the church to support some kind of compromise on behalf of those Presbyterians like me who are concerned about loose voter ID rules and observations and some of the other things that other people want? Or are we just going to continue to demand what we demand and claim to be victimized and oppressed?
And thank you for asking that question, Jack, because you're right. At the Presbyterian Church, we have a bunch of different perspectives, but the issue is that there is no compromise, right? There is just this one side, and that's it. No one's coming to the table with anything else.
When you say there's no room for compromise, you're not really playing politics. It's a
No. I'm not saying there is no room for compromise. I'm saying there is no compromise. There's no compromise bill. If there was a bill on the table, then we have the opportunity to discuss a middle ground, but there's no bill coming to the table.
Okay. Should there be one?
There should be one. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, there absolutely should be a bill coming to the table, because fact of the matter is, even though we might have different opinions on different aspects of the whole voting rights issue, the fact is there are people being oppressed, right? The fact is there are people who are not able to vote, and as an American citizen, that's your right. It's your right to be able to go and place your ballot.
But for the most part, the vast majority of citizens of this country don't want to be either considered to be oppressors or to oppress. And we demonize our opponents when maybe we should just realize they are rivals and not demons.
Yeah, and
Jack, if I may just jump in real quick, Jimmy, I think that one of the things that we all have to acknowledge is that parties in power have done gerrymandering to their own advantage over the years.
Okay.
So I think we need to start there. But that being the case, in the most recent years, most of us recognize that North Carolina has basically been split 50-50, red and blue, during presidential elections. And in fact, the congressional representation has been more like 9-3, most recently 8-5, which doesn't reflect that balance of vote, but rather reflects a very creative effort at gerrymandering, recognizing the fact that the other party has done that when they were in power as well. But that being the case, I think rather than just accepting the way things are, it would be great, like Christian said, if there were a proposal that we have a nonpartisan commission to establish these districts rather than one political party or the other. So I'm done. Thanks for listening.
And I'm just going to echo what's been said. I do think we right now are at a place in this country where we are not engaged in discourse with one another. We are so partisan, we're so divided from one another that one of my frustrations with the US Senate is that you have 50 Republicans, 50 Democrats. And I'm concerned, where are the moderates right now? It's a group of moderates, 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats sat down and came up with a series of bills that they both compromised on, they both had wins on. They could run the Senate. I mean, it doesn't matter who has the majority. So we're at a point right now we're in, and Jack, when you talk about people being demonized, that is happening on both sides. And so I think right now we have got to learn, one, to challenge our legislators to understand that before they are Democrats, before they're Republicans, before they're independents, before they're Greens, but they are public servants. They really are public servants. But we've gotten to a point right now wherein there's absolutely no sitting down at the table. I remember before John McCain died, and John McCain really bemoaned the fact that Democrats and Republicans in the Senate were unable to even have lunch together anymore. They used to literally be friends across the aisles. And so you look at it now, everyone's out to win. And I do think that we've got to start challenging our legislators. And I will say this to all of us who are listening, we have the power. We really do. But the thing is that we have gotten so numb, and there is political disenfranchisement going on. People who want to vote can't vote. And there's so much separation in this nation right now. And it goes beyond race and gender, the political separation.
It does.
It's so great that we're having a difficult time bridging those gaps.
Then, and the reason I'm here is I sense that maybe I'm 1 against 24, but that's okay. It's just that when I see a slide that says, basically, I'm a voter suppressionist, I feel a little intimidated. And I'm just trying to let you all know that some of us in the extreme minority of this group, and perhaps even in the church, are feeling that way. And that's enough said.
Jess, you had your hand up.
I do. And thank you, Jack, for your comments. I really appreciate them. And I appreciate the last part in particular. And I'm kind of shifting the discussion a little bit here, but I had a question. You brought up some of the laws around felons, and I know that that's been a particular issue where I serve. I'm on the border of Guilford and Alamance County, and I know that felons in Alamance County, people that have formerly been incarcerated or not actively serving, have had their voices suppressed in terms of their votes. And so I wanted to talk a little bit more about that, specifically because I have a felon in my congregation. He is actively incarcerated. He has had issues that I have had to utilize my political voice to support. And it would really be great if he could use his own voice. And if we lived in a nation that recognized that though he had made a mistake, which he fully admits to making, and that had very real consequences, right? How do we empower felons to vote? How do we empower the system to better address the needs of people that have been incarcerated? And I was just really curious if you could kind of address that, especially as the people who claim to believe in grace within a political system that too often doesn't recognize that for people who have sinned and who have tried to repent of their sin and are not being allowed to do so.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm glad that you asked. So within the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, there is actually a clause in there for people who have felonies on their record and voting. So when it comes to having a felony, the different states handle things differently. So for example, in Florida, if you had a felony on your record, you could not vote. However, I think in maybe 2019, they passed a bill that kind of overturned that. So it's important to, as I said before, look at your state's laws. Look at how your state is handling felonies and people who have felonies and how they're able to vote, because sometimes it's also based on the type of felony that you have. It's based on if it was a violent crime versus if it was a different type of crime or whatever have you. So that's going to be extremely important. But as you said, this in terms of grace, right? If a person has served, right? If a person has served their sentence and are now out fully integrated into society, they should have the same rights that every other citizen has. So the John Lewis Voting Rights Act has a clause in there that addresses that very thing that you just brought up.
And I would also say, contact the governor. We have a Presbyterian Democratic governor of the state right now, because, in Virginia, it wasn't the last governor, but I think it was Terry, who re-enfranchised felons in the state of his own authority. And I don't know if the state of North Carolina could do that, but I would definitely contact the governor's office and ask what is his understanding of the governor's authority to grant the right to vote to those who were incarcerated who have served their term in jail. Term in office, term in jail, sometimes it means the same thing.
Wes?
I want to bring up an issue that I don't get here talked about very frequently. This past election, this past November, I served as an election worker for my county because I had heard so much about fewer and fewer people willing to do it, especially with COVID. I'm young, my job's flexible enough that they'll allow me to miss a day or take a day off. And so I did that, one, because that way people in my community could see their pastor working the polls to show that there is trustworthy, you can trust that your vote is safe and secure. But this year, our Board of Elections just reduced early voting locations to 1 for the entire county. And they claim lack of funding, right? But this past election, November, we had some early voting. It was just a municipal election. And I was there from 5 a.m. to about 8 o'clock p.m. I think I got 2 bathroom breaks. We were so swamped. Now, as a 35-year-old man who's in good shape, I was so exhausted after working an election. That was just a municipal election. Now looking ahead to primaries in North Carolina, it's Senate, and then of course House if we ever get these issues worked out. So how can the federal government address funding for local elections? Because no one's going to get a chance to vote if we reduce the number of polling places down so much that no one's willing to even work them. Because I'll tell you, I don't know who would on their right mind would volunteer to work an election with the conditions that election workers have to face.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question, because you brought up 2 great points: 1, funding, and 2, manpower, right? We need people to actually run these things. But again, the Freedom to Vote Act, that's in there, right? Funding for local elections, funding for statewide elections, so that you can bring in the people necessary and have the polling places necessary for your different locations. So I'm going to share my slides, but I'm also going to share the action alert that Liz had up at the end of the presentation that has links to the different bills, so that you all can look at the different bills and see the different aspects of the bills that kind of get at what you all are asking.
Can also say that if anyone is concerned about voter security, work an election, because you will not be after you work the election. It is so difficult for someone. I can't even imagine how someone would try to vote twice with the amount of work that it would take. And rule in North Carolina is you have to work in your precinct so people know who you are. And so our elections are very secure.
Well, I just echo what's been said. I love those long pauses that we have, and it's only really 2 or 3 seconds, but it seems like minutes. We're sitting here looking at the screen. Wes, I really appreciate your sharing it, because I do think we need to double down on also volunteering at the polls and being present, because, you know, I looked over a webpage before we came here from, who was this? From Global Citizens, and they list that as one of the obstacles to a free and fair election. Wherein the polls are not adequately funded, you don't have enough workers. So those are things that we've got to ensure, especially locally. And so I think that as congregations, there are 2 things that you cannot do in the name of your church. because it's a nonprofit and falls under the Johnson Amendment. You cannot obviously endorse a candidate under any circumstances. Your pastor can't tell you who to vote for. The church can't pass out campaign literature as far as telling people who to vote for. And you can't do funding. You can't receive funding from a candidate to host an event, or the congregation, the church can't give money to a candidate. But voter education can be done, volunteering at polls, even during early voting. You can use church vehicles to take people to vote. We used to do that in Durham when I pastored at Covenant Presbyterian Church, called it Souls to the Polls. So there's a wide array of activities that you can do. You can even be engaged in voter registration as a congregation, allowing nonprofits to come in to use your site. And another, again, that I would encourage you to encourage your members to volunteer. I mean, we are at a stage right now where voting is being so bombarded by misinformation, by attacks, and also by, I think there's a level of apathy in the country, where, and Christian shared that we had 60% participation in the last election. That means that 40% of Americans did not vote. Now, some because they were unable to vote, but a lot of, and I do think the last couple of elections, the percentages have risen because actually they were going down, down, down. But we've got to reinvigorate people about voting and how it is a right of every American citizen to have it, but also that they need to express that right to vote. And so I think you're sharing that is really vital, that we've got to get up and on election day, be at the polls and volunteer and participate. And vote for as many Presbyterians as you can, but I didn't tell you who to vote for. So Frank, I know you're very engaged in North Carolina. And by not being in the state, what is the hope for is the redistricting going to be done by the next election? That's the order of the state Supreme Court.
Well, that's in the works, I think, even now. So it's very much in limbo. Mm-hmm. And we're talking about congressional districts as well as state legislative districts. One thing I want to just bring up and see what you all think about, and that is, there are not only issues about creating barriers to voting in terms of polling places and things like that, but there are also issues now about who is going to certify the count in terms of enabling legislatures to have an approval of a count. And I don't understand all that, but it's not just people being able to vote, but how are we counting the vote? Can you all speak to that? Do you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely mm-hmm. understand what you're saying. Liz, if you wanted to kind of talk a little more about the electoral count.
Yeah, so that's kind of where that Electoral Count Act that I talked about at the end comes into play. So there's kind of two pieces here when we talk about the process of voting, counting the votes, and then a transition of power. One is like voting rights. So like you said, access to voting, gerrymandering, all those pieces. And then there's everything that happens after the polls close. So that's what the Electoral Count Reform Act is trying to target, is to prevent election subversion, to prevent rogue electors sending different results to Congress than are what actually happened in the state, to prevent members of Congress from voting not to certify a state's electors. You might remember, like last year on January 6th, several members of Congress voted to reject certain states' electors because they claimed that fraud had occurred in those states. So this is really about targeting what circumstances members of Congress are allowed to reject a state's electors, to kind of prevent election subversion, basically, to ensure that the will of the people is done, to ensure that the way that a state votes is the way that the electoral votes will be counted in the end. However, as far as like details of what that act will look like, it's still pretty unclear. We know that Republicans and Democrats are working together on this issue. This is a pretty bipartisan issue. A lot of the moderate Republicans are working alongside moderate Democrats to try to get something done. But as far as actual details of what it will look like, it's pretty unclear, but there are people who are working on it and trying to find a solution to just really ensure that the will of the people is protected. I hope that answers your question.
That's a big help. So we need to pay attention to that. Thanks.
And then Frank, especially on the state level, because that's what made the Georgia state law so criticized, is that they're empowering the legislators with the ability to basically overturn the results of elections. So I think to a large degree, a lot depends on whether the bill that Liz has been talking about passes into law. But if it does not, then you're going to have to do it state by state, really, and to really combat these laws. And I will say on that level, when a bill is coming up in your state, raise an outcry. I mean, they are listening, and they want to know how their constituents are feeling. And oftentimes, if there's silence, they think that is consent. But immediately, and you have to do it quickly. You really have to respond right then. Oftentimes, you really don't have weeks to respond. You have to do it in a series of days. But when a bill is coming up that you think is going to suppress the vote or you disagree with, make sure that if you can get petitions, you can get signatures, because again, what they care about are the number of constituents who hold a certain position. So be sure that you speak about it. Again, Frank, it's going to have to deal with, I think, to a large degree, state by state.
That's also where local elections matter a lot too. People like Secretary of State, Lieutenant Governor, those kinds of safeguards are really important just to ensure that people are elected that are concerned with making sure that the will of the people is done in their state. That's Secretary of State elections are particularly important around this topic also.
Jack?
This question is for you, Jimmie. You might be the only person who knows the answer to this, but I've wondered from time to time about how frequently we can be in touch with our representatives without becoming maybe tagged as just a person who is a malcontent. There is an issue a week, and sometimes more, that come out of your office. And so, if I write somebody on every one of those issues, one thing I'm interested to know is whether if they track how frequently particular voters are in touch with them. And I'm sorry, we've got stuff going on here.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, Jack.
So it's a question of how often do you raise your gun and fire off a shot, or do you keep your powder dry? And are you more effectively occasionally than constantly? Does that make sense?
Yeah, Christian is actually more qualified to answer this, but I'm gonna give a shot at it anyway. That never stopped me before. I don't think, Jack, they're keeping up with individuals unless you are a nuisance, unless you're badgering the staff, you're making phone calls, harassing emails, things along that line, because they definitely take into consideration how respectful you are. And so that's one of the things that we really encourage people: be respectful, even in the midst of disagreements. Because once you are labeled, you will be blackballed. But the other part of that is that if you get the staff to know you and like you, because it's not always direct communications with your legislator, but with the members of the staff. And if they recognize that you're a respectful person and that there have been some areas of agreement with you, that gets you an inroad. It's all about relationships. It really is. And that's why one of the things we try to do is find out who in our congregations have relationships with members of Congress, because they will be an inroad so that they will know us personally. But I'd say stay away from the negatives. Don't tell them that's a stupid idea or I disagree with you, because it's about convincing them, changing their minds with those with whom you disagree. Now, encourage those with whom you agree with, but again, always do it in a way wherein you treat individuals like you want to be treated. But I don't think they're keeping up with individuals. It's more, they look at the numbers. How many of our constituents are on this side? How many are speaking out on this issue? Kristen, what would you add?
Yeah, just the same thing. They're looking at numbers, and to also give as much positive feedback as you are negative feedback, in terms of if they pass a bill that you like, send them an email saying, hey, thank you, right? If they are supporting something, send them an email and say, thank you. But as Jimmie said, the only people that are being quote unquote blackballed or being screened or whatever have you are the people who are intentionally just sending absurd negative feedback. This is stupid, that's dumb, whatever have you. If you're going to give criticism, make sure that it's constructive. Make sure that it's a direction, giving them a direction. You're giving them something that they can work towards or whatever have you. And as I said, make sure that you're also affirming them when they're doing something that you agree with.
Well, I have a follow-up question, and if I contact, and I do, I'm in touch with our senators and our representatives. I'm not a sideline sitter. But if I have a relationship with a staff person, it's not going to be long before they figure out that I don't embrace the Republican agenda. It's not going to be long before they realize that I'm on the Democratic side of things. And so I wonder if they just do they care what I think, because they know there's going to be no political consequence to them for ignoring me. The people that are influential with them are the people who are going to their campaign rallies and things like that. So I wonder if we just get written off when people know that we're not going to help them get elected in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And to be completely honest, sometimes if you don't have that relationship, depending on the makeup of the office, sometimes they'll read your email and just kind of push you off to the side. However, that's the importance of having the relationship, especially with the staffers, because even if if it's a Democratic office and you're a Republican, or if it's a Republican office and you're a Democrat, if you have that relationship, that makes them more willing to come to the table because they have that link with you. And then that leaves an opportunity for there to be conversation, for there to be compromise, to hearing other sides of the agenda, so to speak. But being willing to kind of start that relationship, regardless of political party, is really important.
Someone told me years ago that ministry is all about relationships. And Christian, I think you are exactly right. And we are at the end of our hour. I am so grateful for how many people have joined us, and especially grateful for the folks in our Washington office, Jimmie, Christian, Liz. Thanks to all of you for the work that you're doing for all of us. Amen.
Hey, Jack.
And Frank, can I say one closing thing?
Yes, and I was going to ask if you would close us in prayer.
Yeah, now what's the day, Tuesday? This is my long prayer day, so. But I do want to highlight Liz. Liz is a fellow in the office, and so during the summer, if you have young people who are part of your congregation or your own personal, your grandchildren, your children, we have summer interns who are with us for 2 months out of the summer, and we have done it remotely the last 2 summers. We also have fellows who are with us for a whole year. So this is an opportunity, if you have young people in your church or in your own personal life who want to be more engaged with public policy, who are really invested in the relationship between faith and politics. I think being with us for a summer or for a year would be a wonderful opportunity. And Liz, did you want to add anything?
Well, I'll just say that I'll put my email in the chat as well. And if you have any young people in your congregations that want to know more about how they can get involved as a young person, please send them to me. I'd be happy to chat.
Okay. All right.
Great.
And thanks for the conversation. It's been a great conversation and hopefully not the last. And so let us close in a word of prayer. Let us pray. Most gracious God, you are a God of love and a God of justice. And you call us to be invested in both, that we live lives when we treat all people with love and tenderness and compassion, even for those with whom we are struggling. You are a God of justice, and it breaks your heart when your people, your children, are treated in cruel, mean, and horrible ways. Continue to bring us together, oh God, as we come together, not simply as Democrats or Republicans, red or blue, but as we come together as people of faith, knowing that we are all here for the same reason. We all have the same dedication to follow Jesus Christ wherever he leads us, to do the will of God, whatever it may be. Oh Lord, we pray for this nation that during this time of inner conflict and turmoil, that we may find ways to work together and to appreciate one another. We pray for the world in which we live, even as war is threatened, even as so many are hungry, even as so many are cold with no place to go. We pray that your wonderful power, that you may continue to provide for those who are considered, in the words of Jesus, the least of these, our brothers and our sisters. In Christ Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we look forward to the next times we can gather. God bless you.
And join us on Sunday or for the recording on Sunday from First Pres Greensboro to hear the next phase of this.